In the heart of Mexico, during the mid-20th century, a gifted young man named Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño built a reputation most would envy. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed, he walked the corridors of the hospital in Monterrey like a man destined for greatness. But as he gently examined patients, prescribed treatments, and mentored young medical students, no one could imagine the monster that lay hidden behind those intelligent eyes. This wasn't just a man of medicine. This was a man who harbored a hunger, one not taught in medical school. Alfredo wasn't just intelligent, he was brilliant. His mastery of anatomy, coupled with an eerie detachment from emotion, made him both respected and feared. Colleagues whispered of his cold demeanor, but no one dared question his skill. What they didn't know is that, behind closed doors, Alfredo had begun experimenting. Small animals at first, dissecting, documenting, controlling. It wasn't the science he loved, it was the power, the godlike ability to explore life and end it. Alfredo lived a double life. By day, he was a doctor. By night, he met secretly with his lover, a man named Jesus Castillo Rangel. In conservative 1950s Mexico, their relationship had to remain in the shadows. But love turned into obsession. Alfredo grew controlling, jealous, and when Jesus began pulling away, Alfredo couldn't handle rejection. Obsession metastasized into rage. On a cold October night in 1959, Jesus vanished. His body was later found, dismembered, drained of blood, and buried on Alfredo's family ranch. But what chilled investigators wasn't just the mutilation. It was the precision. Each incision mirrored that of a practiced surgeon. He didn't panic. He didn't make a mistake. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a procedure. Detectives on the case were baffled. Who could do something so clean? They discovered blood-soaked sheets, a scalpel missing from the hospital, and letters revealing Alfredo's increasingly obsessive behavior toward Jesus. When brought in for questioning, Alfredo didn't flinch. He spoke with calm, detached reasoning, as if he were describing someone else's crime. The mask of the healer was slipping. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, locals, even fellow doctors came to witness the trial of the physician-turned-killer. Alfredo sat emotionless, almost bored, as gruesome details were read aloud. Psychiatrists diagnosed him as a sociopath, brilliant but without empathy. He was sentenced to death. And yet, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Just 2 years after his sentence, Mexico abolished the death penalty. Alfredo's fate changed overnight. His sentence was commuted to 20 years in prison. Inside prison walls, Alfredo found his element again. He became the prison doctor. Inmates respected him, some even admired him. He stitched wounds by day and dissected animal corpses at night, still obsessing over anatomy and the perfection of death. He wasn't just surviving in prison. He was thriving. In the 1970s, a young journalist named Thomas Harris visited the prison to research a Mexican doctor who had treated a notorious American killer. Harris expected a rough, ex-convict medic. What he found instead was Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño, soft-spoken, cultured, chillingly intelligent. A man who looked directly into Harris's soul and read him like a book. That encounter haunted Harris. It would later inspire his creation of Dr. Hannibal Lecter. While the world devoured the silence of the lambs, few realized the truth. Hannibal Lecter wasn't entirely fiction. The refined tone, the surgical skill, the predator behind the charm, all drawn from that single, eerie meeting behind prison walls. The real-life Lecter was still alive, and he was getting out. In 1981, Alfredo was released from prison. He returned to Monterrey and lived quietly, opening a small clinic, treating the poor, and fading into the background. Some said he found redemption. Others believed the monster simply learned to wear a better mask. He never killed again, or so we're told. In 2009, Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño died of cancer. He was 81. To some, he died a doctor. But to those who knew the truth, he died as the real-life Hannibal Lecter. Justice, in a way, was served. Alfredo was stripped of his title, imprisoned, and exposed. But the full story only came to light decades later, hidden behind a fictional character that captivated the world. There's a terrifying irony in how fiction concealed the truth. But now you know, beneath the mask of Hannibal Lecter lies a real man, killer, a doctor, a genius, and his twisted obsession was more than a story. It was a legacy of death, carved with surgical precision. Even before the murder, whispers followed Alfredo down hospital hallways. Medical students recalled the way he lingered in autopsy rooms, how he requested cadaver work others found repulsive. Some dismissed it as academic passion, but there was something too deliberate in the way he handled flesh, not just skill, reverence. Colleagues now wondered, had the killer been in plain sight long before Jesus's murder? Had Alfredo been practicing on more than just animals? During a post-trial audit, a clerk discovered a collection of patient files stashed in a locked cabinet once used by Alfredo. Several of the files were incomplete, missing names, missing test results, vanished patients, all treated by the same doctor. One nurse remembered a young man who had checked in for stomach pain. He never checked out. Authorities tried to investigate, but time and silence had buried the evidence. Had Jesus simply been the one Alfredo got caught for? In prison, Alfredo wrote obsessively. Journals, diagrams, detailed anatomical sketches. He filled notebooks with thoughts about mortality, divinity, and control. But one journal stood out, filled with coded entries. A linguist later claimed it resembled a cipher, one used to mask names or dates. When decoded, some entries referenced C1, L3, T2. Medical codes? Victims? Or trophies? We'll never know for sure, but the codes ended the day Alfredo was arrested. Years after his release, Alfredo contacted a local university. He offered to donate his brain for scientific research, specifically to be studied for abnormalities linked to psychopathy and genius. The request was declined, not because it wasn't valuable, but because the institution feared what it symbolized. Even in death, Alfredo sought control over how he would be remembered, not as a killer but as a case study. When the Silence of the Lambs became a global phenomenon, few in Mexico dared to say what they suspected, that the inspiration was one of their own. But some spoke in hushed tones, professors who taught beside him, journalists who heard rumors. They described it as the Lecter paradox, a man who took life, yet healed it, who read philosophy, yet dismembered his lover. Alfredo blurred the lines so well, even truth became fiction. Jesus Castillo Rangel had a sister, Maria. After her brother's disappearance, she demanded justice, tirelessly pushing investigators to look closer. She never spoke to the media. Decades later, in a rare interview, she said something haunting. They called him a doctor, but he wasn't trying to save lives. He wanted to see what he could take apart, without anyone noticing. Her grief never softened. She called his release a betrayal. To her, there was no mystery, just evil in disguise. After Hannibal Lecter captivated cinema, more films began featuring intelligent killers, refined, articulate, calculating. The killer genius trope was born. But few realized that behind the archetype was Alfredo's cold stare, his surgical talent, and his taste for power. He became the blueprint, and in a strange way, the fame he never received in life was immortalized in fiction. In the final years of his life, Alfredo ran a quiet clinic from his home. One woman recalled a visit with her ill child. She described the doctor as calm, respectful, but said something about him unsettled her. As he examined the boy, he whispered softly, "The body is a perfect puzzle, when you know how it fits together." She never returned. When cancer began to eat away at Alfredo, he refused extended care. He denied chemotherapy. He refused hospitalization. Instead, he documented the decline of his own body in excruciating detail. He made notes, annotated pain thresholds, even sketched his tumor's progress. His final act wasn't begging for forgiveness. It was studying his own death. He was both patient and observer. And when he finally died, alone and unrepentant, he left behind no apology, only questions. In the early 2000s, a journalist named Luis Contreras secured a rare interview with Alfredo. It was meant to be part of a series called Monsters Among Us. The footage, however, was never aired. Producers deemed it too unsettling. In the unaired tape, Alfredo never admitted guilt, but he smiled when questioned about the murder. That smile, described as eerie and satisfied, was followed by a quote that would haunt the crew. "We are all surgeons of fate. Some of us simply cut deeper." The tape remains locked in a vault. Monterrey, Mexico, moved on. New buildings rose, children played in parks, and the local hospital Alfredo once worked in got renovated. But the locals never forgot. Some residents still avoid the street where Alfredo lived post-release. Others claim strange noises echo from the ranch where Jesus was buried. Even now, cab drivers lower their voices when his name is spoken. It's not just a memory, it's a ghost. A forensic psychologist later studied Alfredo's court records, medical notes, and prison writings. Her conclusion? He wasn't simply a sociopath. He was a controlled predator, one who compartmentalized guilt and emotion so completely that he functioned in society for years without suspicion. She noted something chilling. He didn't lack empathy. He understood it perfectly. He just saw it as a tool. A university archivist cataloging rare medical books found something peculiar in 2011. A leather-bound anatomy journal with detailed handwritten notes in Spanish. Inside were anatomical diagrams and entries signed only ABT. One entry described the process of draining and sectioning tissue to maximize silence. The archivist had unknowingly uncovered one of Alfredo's private study journals, hidden within the school's collection for decades. To this day, it remains sealed to the public. Thomas Harris never publicly named Alfredo as the inspiration for Hannibal Lecter. But in a rare interview, when asked how he created such a terrifying character, Harris paused and said, "He was already created. I just gave him a mask." Many believe that was his way of confirming it without igniting legal or ethical backlash. Alfredo didn't just inspire Hannibal. He was him. In 2017, a medical student in Guadalajara was arrested after police found mutilated remains in his apartment, dissected with surgical skill. Inside his desk was a worn copy of The Silence of the Lambs, underlined heavily. He had scribbled ABT in the margins. Was he a copycat? Or part of a new generation fascinated by genius killers in fiction? Authorities feared Alfredo's legacy might have birthed a new nightmare. Shortly before his death, Alfredo sent a sealed envelope to a former colleague, one of the few people who visited him during his final days. Inside was a single note: "No one dies as a monster in their own story." There was no signature, only a diagram of a human heart, neatly divided in half. Alfredo Ballí Treviño escaped the noose. He walked free. He treated patients. He smiled for journalists. For decades, it seemed he outran justice. But justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears a spotlight. By exposing the truth, peeling back the fiction, revealing the real monster behind Hannibal Lecter, this story does what a gavel never could. It unmasks him. It reminds the world that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in Latin. Sometimes it dresses in a white coat. Sometimes it offers help with one hand while hiding a scalpel in the other. But in the end, truth shines brighter than charm. And justice, though delayed, has been served. In the eyes of every person now watching, listening, and remembering the name, Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño, the real-life Hannibal Lecter. After Alfredo's death, one of his former assistants, now elderly, came forward with a disturbing confession. She claimed that Alfredo kept a collection of antique surgical tools, obsessively cleaned and arranged in a velvet-lined case. Many were no longer in use. Some, she said, were blood-stained but polished, as if preserved as trophies. Authorities found no such tools when they searched his home. They had mysteriously vanished. A retired pathologist from the hospital where Alfredo once trained recalled a strange moment from decades earlier. A body had arrived at the morgue, a homeless man with no known family. Alfredo had requested to observe the autopsy, citing educational reasons. What the pathologist remembered most wasn't the autopsy itself. But Alfredo's reaction. He was calm, intrigued, almost joyful. He even asked if he could finish the internal dissection. The request was denied, but the memory lingered. During Alfredo's medical school years, he submitted a thesis proposal titled "The Psychology of Anatomical Power, the Emotional Detachment of the Surgeon." It was rejected. Professors found it unsettling, too abstract, too philosophical, too dark. But the draft, recovered years later, offered disturbing insight into his mindset. In it, Alfredo wrote, "The scalpel is not merely an instrument. It is the divider of truth and illusion, of what the body claims to be and what it truly is." It was his manifesto in disguise. A grainy photograph resurfaced in 2015 from a box of old hospital records. It showed Alfredo in the late 50s, standing beside a cadaver, smiling for the camera. But there was something wrong. The cadaver's chest had been opened, and Alfredo held a scalpel as if posing with his masterpiece, not documenting medicine, but showing off his control. The photo was quietly destroyed, but not before it was copied. Alfredo's family never spoke publicly about the case. But a cousin later told an investigative reporter that Alfredo's obsession with death had roots deeper than anyone knew. Their grandfather had been a butcher, known for his ritualistic animal slaughter and his strange notebooks on pain thresholds. Alfredo often visited him as a boy. Some believe that's where it started. Not in medical school, but in a barn with blood-soaked aprons and sharpened knives. Years after Alfredo's release, a woman came forward with a disturbing claim. She said Alfredo had treated her for a minor surgery, and afterward, she awoke with strange scars she didn't remember consenting to. Internal bleeding followed. She was hospitalized elsewhere. No records of the surgery were ever filed. Alfredo denied ever treating her. She was dismissed as delusional, but her scars? They remain. For years, Alfredo claimed the murder of Jesus was a crime of passion. A single tragic act, never to be repeated. But letters recovered from his prison locker told a different story. In them, he described dreams of dissection, referenced unnamed experiments, and hinted at more cleansed acts. Each removal was a release, he wrote in one. If Jesus was the only victim, why speak of each? What else did he do in the dark, with no one watching? After his death, online forums emerged, small but disturbing communities that viewed Alfredo as a misunderstood genius. They compared him to fictional characters. Some even saw him as a visionary who broke societal norms. The glorification of killers is not new. But this was different. They didn't admire his violence. They admired his composure, his aesthetic, his intellect, his ability to manipulate the system. It's a dangerous illusion, and one that still spreads. In 2022, a movement began in Monterrey to rename a local library wing that once carried Alfredo's family name. Survivors, activists, and journalists pushed to erase any honors tied to him. They succeeded. Plaque was removed. The name was replaced. And for the first time publicly, the city acknowledged not just the doctor, but the killer he truly was. Justice, in the end, isn't always a sentence. Sometimes it's the removal of a name from a place of honor. In 1989, a former student of Alfredo, now a respected surgeon, confessed in a closed interview that he once admired Alfredo's precision, his cold detachment, and what he called surgical poetry. But after learning about the murder, and after years of silence, the student admitted he'd once seen something disturbing. Alfredo dissecting a pig with obsessive focus, whispering to it as if it were human. The student walked away that day. He never spoke to Alfredo again. A high-ranking politician once attended a medical gala where Alfredo, now a free man, was also present. They sat across from one another. Alfredo was polite, charismatic, eloquent, even charming. But after the dinner, the politician admitted something to his security aide. He never broke eye contact, even when I wasn't speaking. It was like being studied, not socially, medically. That man never returned to another hospital fundraiser again. In a decaying warehouse near Monterrey's old courthouse, thousands of unscanned police files were rediscovered during a digitalization initiative. Buried among them were unconnected missing persons reports from the 1950s and 60s. All young men, all disappeared near the same regions Alfredo frequented. No proof tied him to these disappearances, but the similarities, ages, last sightings, proximity to his ranch were uncanny. It was as if Jesus had simply been the only thread that unraveled. A criminal profiler once attempted to compile a full psychological autopsy on Alfredo Ballí Treviño. She described him as a clinical narcissist with a god complex, mixed with classic traits of high-functioning psychopathy, charm, manipulation, zero remorse. She also concluded, he didn't just want control over life and death. He wanted to master it, to redefine it through his own scalpel. He wasn't content with medicine. He wanted dominion. An investigative journalist later revealed that Alfredo was obsessed with historical execution methods, including medieval surgical torture. He owned rare books, banned journals, and even a self-bound notebook detailing ancient dissection rituals. Some entries included drawings of body parts, labeled not in Spanish or Latin, but in personal code names. He'd created his own anatomical language, a language only he understood. During renovations of a small rental property once owned by Alfredo's family, workers discovered an odd room hidden behind a false wall, tiled entirely in red ceramic. There were no windows. A drain sat in the center of the floor, and on one of the walls, etched faintly into the tile, were the letters JCR, Jesus Castillo Rangel. No further evidence was found, but the implications? Terrifying. Why was Alfredo released early? Some say political pressure. Others whisper about bribes, influence, or simply the legal chaos of the era. But a now declassified memo reveals a chilling line written by a justice official in 1980. No need to worry. Dr. Treviño is a civilized man. Civilized. A man who drained and buried his lover was called civilized. The law, it seemed, wore blindfolds for more than balance. In 2023, a university student presented a thesis titled Ethics versus Empathy in the Surgical Mind. Within it, he cited Alfredo, not as a criminal, but as a tragic case of genius unbound by morality. The paper caused outrage. Professors rejected it. But the conversation had begun. How do we separate brilliance from brutality? Where is the line between surgical detachment and human cruelty? In the end, Alfredo Ballí Treviño didn't get a dramatic downfall. No manhunt, no chase, no cinematic confession. He lived, he was freed, and he died alone. A man who carved up flesh and fooled a nation. But the scalpel he once held to cut apart others is now turned back on him. Each chapter, each revelation, slices through his facade, not with rage, but with truth. Because stories, like surgeries, must expose the parts we wish to hide. And in doing so, we reclaim justice, not for him, but for Jesus Castillo Rangel, a name that no longer hides beneath the legend of Hannibal Lecter, but rises above it, demanding to be remembered. In the early 1950s, before Alfredo became a known figure, he led a small underground group of fellow medical students who called themselves El Círculo Anatómico. On paper, it was a study group, young minds hungry for advanced surgical knowledge. But multiple former members, interviewed under anonymity, described something far more disturbing. They practiced on animals, then on cadavers, then on each other. One student recalled Alfredo instructing them to make small incisions on their arms and close the wound like an artist, not a butcher. He called it discipline through discomfort. Eventually, the club disbanded. One member reportedly suffered nerve damage after a failed experiment involving muscle exposure. None of it was ever reported to the school. But it was there, in that hidden circle, that Alfredo's obsession with the intimacy of incisions was born. A peculiar pattern emerged in Alfredo's public life post-prison. Despite gaining media attention, having patience, and giving interviews, he left behind very little. No close friends, no longtime staff, no digital trace in an era when everything was becoming searchable. A sociologist studying high-functioning killers called him the man with no shadow. He existed fully in public, yet never left a footprint, she said. Was it intentional? Did Alfredo learn, during his prison years, how to cleanse not just wounds, but his own identity? Some believe he mastered the art of being seen without ever being known. In 2008, an ambitious young journalist named Maritza Gonzalez began working on a full-length exposé titled "The Doctor Who Played God." She contacted former victims' families, ex-colleagues, and even attempted to interview Alfredo through a third party. 3 months into her investigation, she withdrew from the project. Friends say she became paranoid, withdrawn, and refused to talk about her work. She told one confidant, "I opened a door I wasn't meant to." To this day, her research remains locked in a private vault. She never wrote again. A disturbing discovery was made in 2014 when a property once owned by Alfredo's family was sold to a private buyer. While excavating for a garden installation, workers uncovered several small bones beneath the floorboards of an old shed. Authorities were called. The bones were identified as non-human, possibly pig or goat, but they were oddly arranged in symmetrical rows, like a ceremonial display. An old farmer from the region claimed Alfredo had once kept animals there for study. But the arrangement was not scientific. It was ritualistic. A statement never made it to the press. One of Alfredo's most chilling possessions, later found among his belongings after death, was a framed painting of Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, face twisted in ecstatic pain. On the back of the frame, he had written, "Pain is the only truth that cannot lie." Multiple people who visited his home said he stared at the painting during conversations, as if it calmed him. Was it guilt or admiration? Dr. Ricardo Fuentes, one of Alfredo's mentors during medical school, was known for his strict ethics and surgical brilliance. But in a 1975 interview, Fuentes admitted he once covered for a student who had gone too far during a cadaver dissection. Removing tissue he was explicitly told to leave intact. Though he never named the student, documents later revealed it was Alfredo. Why did Fuentes protect him? Because he was gifted, Fuentes later said. He didn't see the dead as objects. He saw them as puzzles. The comment was meant as praise. Now, it sounds like a prophecy. After Alfredo's release, a network of doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators quietly passed around unspoken warnings. Don't work alone with him. Don't refer vulnerable patients. Don't question his procedures. It was never written down, but everyone in Monterrey's medical community knew the code. No one reported him. No one wanted to risk their license or their safety. Even after justice was served in court, fear kept its own record. Jesus Castillo Rangel was often described as kind, emotional, and deeply in love. But what many don't know is that, shortly before his murder, Jesus had confronted Alfredo about exposing him, outing their relationship in an era and region where such truths brought shame, violence, or worse. A friend of Jesus said he was preparing to leave Alfredo for good. He had written a letter, never sent, that read, "I won't be your secret anymore." That letter was found in Jesus's room, sealed in an envelope addressed to a local paper. Alfredo likely found it first, and silenced him forever. Though Thomas Harris never admitted it directly, literary scholars have since traced elements of Alfredo's life through all of Hannibal Lecter's portrayals. Not just in the original novel. The surgical elegance, the educated diction, the love of classical music, the ability to manipulate with quiet charm. But most haunting of all is Lecter's silence about his crimes. The mask, just like Alfredo. In every adaptation, the most terrifying thing isn't the violence. It's the stillness before it. As Alfredo lay dying in 2009, one nurse reported that he kept muttering the same sentence in his final hours, over and over again. "The cut must be clean, always clean." When asked if he needed help, he looked her in the eye and whispered, "There are no unclean cuts, only unclean hearts." He never apologized. He never confessed. But in that final moment, beneath the morphine and age, he spoke not like a man, but like a surgeon still lost in his own twisted theater. Years after Alfredo's death, an elderly priest from a Monterrey parish came forward with a secret that had haunted him for decades. He claimed that in 1982, Alfredo had come to his confessional, unannounced, unaccompanied, and unlike anything the priest had ever seen. He didn't kneel. He stood. As if speaking to an equal, the priest said. In that dimly lit booth, Alfredo didn't beg forgiveness. He dissected his sin like a post-mortem report, clinically, deliberately. He confessed not only to the murder of Jesus, but alluded to other experiments in pain, phrasing that chilled the priest to his bones. But because it was under the sacred seal of confession, he could not go to the police. "I saw the devil wear the face of reason," he whispered, "and I did nothing." To this day, the priest says he's still unsure if it was a genuine confession or a performance, a calculated performance for an audience of one God. After Alfredo's death, his body was sent for a standard autopsy. But an anonymous pathologist who had followed the case for years conducted a secret secondary examination. He wanted to study the brain of the man who had fascinated and terrified a nation. What he found wasn't supernatural. No tumors, no abnormalities, nothing to explain the monstrous intelligence behind the crimes. But there was one anomaly, a long-healed fracture at the base of the skull, likely from a childhood injury. It had subtly warped the cranial structure near the temporal lobe, the region associated with impulse control and empathy. Could this have been the crack that let the darkness in? Or was it just coincidence? He never submitted his findings officially, but he kept the scan, framed, like a reminder that monsters might not be born but made. A documentary filmmaker once asked a group of young medical students to watch interviews with Alfredo Treviño and then record their reactions. What followed was unsettling. Several students expressed discomfort, not because of his crime, but because they recognized something in him. "He talks like our best professors," one said, "like someone who understands anatomy more than humanity." It forced a reflection none of them expected, about the line between professionalism and detachment, precision and dehumanization. The mirror Alfredo held up wasn't just for criminals. It was for medicine itself. In every surgeon's hand lies a question. Do you cut to heal, or do you heal to cut? Jesus Castillo Rangel was buried without ceremony. No monument, no portrait, just a name on a weathered headstone in a neglected part of the cemetery. But in 2023, after decades of campaigning by human rights activists and journalists, that changed. A mural was commissioned in Monterrey, not of Alfredo, not of his legend, but of Jesus. Smiling, young, alive. Underneath, it reads, "No soy tu sombra, soy tu verdad. I am not your shadow, I am your truth." Sometimes justice doesn't wear a judge's robe. Sometimes it wears paint. Sometimes it speaks with color louder than any sentence ever could. In the end, the story of Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño, the so-called real-life Hannibal Lecter, is not just about a murder or a brilliant doctor-turned-killer. It's about how evil hides not in monsters, but in men who know how to wear masks. It's about how intelligence, when divorced from empathy, becomes a weapon. It's about systems, legal, medical, cultural, that can be manipulated by charm, prestige, and the illusion of civility. Alfredo fooled the law. He fooled his colleagues. He fooled the world. But he never fooled the truth, because the truth cuts deeper than any scalpel. And in the end, long after the silence, the rumors, the documentaries, and books, it is Jesus's name that remains, not as a victim, but as the final voice, a voice that says, "I was not just a body to be studied. I was not an error to be erased. I was a man, and I mattered." Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers, but its cuts are clean and permanent. In 1993, a cassette tape was discovered in a box of hospital storage records during a routine audit. Labeled only Confession ABT, it contained 47 minutes of audio. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Calm, articulate, chilling. Alfredo. But it wasn't a confession in the legal sense. It was a monologue, a personal dissection of morality, pain, and control. At one point, he said, "There is no such thing as evil, only disorder. I simply rearranged what was already broken." He never mentioned Jesus by name, He spoke only in metaphors. Cold, detached, surgical. The tape was never aired. Officials feared copycats and worse, fans. To this day, it remains locked away in a federal archive. After his release from prison, Alfredo resumed practicing medicine, but unofficially. Hidden behind closed doors, he treated the sick, the poor, the undocumented, people with no voice, no protection, and no paper trail. One woman claimed she took her diabetic brother to Alfredo in 1990. She swears he saved his life. He was gentle, she said. Too gentle. Like he wanted to study us. Rumors swirled of procedures done in cash, in silence, without anesthesia. But no one ever filed a complaint. Why? Because for many, a monster doctor was still a doctor. And survival sometimes means accepting the devil's touch. In 2022, an estate sale uncovered a series of handwritten journals belonging to a distant relative of Jesus Castillo Rangel. Inside was a bombshell, letters Jesus had written unsent, describing escalating psychological abuse. Alfredo wasn't just possessive. He was paranoid, controlling, and manipulative. He wants to own my thoughts, Jesus wrote. He says my smile is his property. One entry ends abruptly. If anything happens to me, he did it. These weren't romantic letters. They were cries for help. But no one ever heard them until now. The trial of Alfredo Ballí Treviño in 1961 was over in less than a month. No journalists were allowed inside. No psychologists were consulted. No forensic reconstruction was requested. One judge later admitted, off the record, "We didn't want to know how deep it went. We just wanted it to go away." It wasn't justice. It was a cleanup, an attempt to bury not just a body, but a scandal. A warning. Sometimes, a courtroom is just a theater, and the performance hides more than it reveals. One woman, a young psychiatrist named Dr. Valeria Ibarra, was tasked with evaluating Alfredo during his incarceration. He refused to speak at first, but eventually he opened up, not with answers but riddles. He told her, "You must never ask me why. You must ask yourself why you want to know." Their sessions stretched into months. She wrote 500 pages of notes. Then one day she stopped, resigned, disappeared from the field. No one knows what he said to her, but her final note, left in her desk drawer, read, "There are minds you must not enter, even in the name of medicine." In 1964, just 3 years after Alfredo's trial, another young man went missing near the rural outskirts of Monterrey. Same age as Jesus, similar appearance. The family reported it, filed every form, begged the police, but the case was never opened. Why? Because the lead investigator was a friend of the Treviño family. The documents were quietly shelved. No public notice, no search party. The only clue left behind? A blood-stained scarf, buried in a field not far from Alfredo's ranch. It was never tested, never entered into evidence. And still, to this day, no body was found. Monterrey has tried over and over to forget, to bury the name Dr. Alfredo Ballí Treviño beneath layers of modernization, culture, and distance. But every few years, something resurfaces, an article, a podcast, a new witness. Each time, the story mutates, pulling at old wounds. Locals still debate it. Was he a killer? A genius? A misunderstood man ruined by stigma? One thing is certain, his ghost never left. Not from the halls of the hospital, not from the streets of the city, and not from the minds of those who lived through it. One of the most enduring myths of evil is that it wears a grotesque face, that monsters are obvious. But Alfredo teaches us otherwise. He was composed, educated, handsome, respected. Yet beneath that exterior was a man capable of reducing another human being to parts. He didn't see people, one profiler said. He saw function, muscle, tissue, weakness. He turned surgery into scripture and control into religion. And worst of all, he got away with it. For a time. In psychology, there's something called the mirror test, an experiment to determine if a being can recognize itself in a reflection. Alfredo passed every academic test, every surgical exam, every court loophole, but he failed the mirror test of humanity. He never saw himself as the killer, only as the cure. And in the end, that's what separates men like him from the rest of us. Not intelligence, not skill, but the ability or inability to see ourselves in others. Jesus saw love. Alfredo saw ownership. And in that fracture, that fatal imbalance, lives the shadow of a man who could have saved lives, but chose to carve them instead. In 2011, a woman named Beatriz Morales came forward, claiming to have been Alfredo's last living patient before his official death. She was a nurse at a private clinic in Monterrey and had been suffering from an undiagnosed condition, one that Alfredo had allegedly cured during a clandestine consultation. Beatriz was highly secretive about the details of the treatment, but she described Alfredo as disturbingly perfect. She said, "He made me feel safe, but the moment I turned my back, I could feel something cold watching me." Years later, she revealed that, during the course of their treatment, Alfredo had actually experimented on her in ways that went beyond medical procedures. He had observed her reactions to pain, taking notes in his calm, surgical manner. It wasn't until Beatriz began to suffer from severe psychological distress that she realized the full extent of his manipulations. But she, too, was left in silence. She never pressed charges. But her testimony would become pivotal when, just months after her story broke, a new death certificate was uncovered, listing a patient, anonymous, who had died after a surgical complication at Alfredo's hands. It was Beatriz who had survived and lived to tell the story. In the late 1990s, while searching through the forgotten archives of the Monterrey Medical Association, a retired investigator stumbled upon a collection of audio tapes dating back to the early 1960s. The tapes contained detailed interviews, not with patients, but with former colleagues of Dr. Alfredo Treviño. The recordings were chilling. "He asked us to focus on the precision of the incision, not the patient," one doctor admitted. Another whispered, "He told us that true professionals must have no empathy." The final recording, however, took a turn toward the truly sinister. A voice, much softer and more reflective, confessed, "I don't need anyone to forgive me. I did what I had to do, but it was never about them. It was always about me." It wasn't Alfredo's voice. It was Dr. Ricardo Fuentes, his mentor. He had been complicit all along. In 2006, an unmarked envelope was found on the desk of a recently retired police officer, Alejandro Garcia. The officer had worked the original case of Jesus Castillo Rangel's murder and had spent years quietly digging into the details that had been buried. The letter was addressed to the last man with honor, but it wasn't signed. Inside, a cryptic message was written in a mix of Latin and Spanish. Deceptus sub lumen, ego sum pars aegis. The deception is in the light. I am part of it. At first, the officer had no clue what the letter meant. But after decoding the phrase, he was horrified to realize that the letter was a warning. Not only about Alfredo, but about the system that had allowed him to escape justice for so long. The letter was an allegation, a claim that those who participated in the cover-up would eventually face consequences. As the years went by, new pressure began to build on the local Monterrey authorities. Public figures, fueled by the damning testimonies of people like Beatriz and the coded letter, began calling for an official investigation into the forgotten cases surrounding Alfredo's legacy. The renewed investigation dug into not just Alfredo's medical records, but his connections to powerful figures in the region. Key government officials, who had worked with Alfredo's family for years, were questioned. In an astonishing twist, a prominent lawyer who had been a close friend of Alfredo's family and who had previously handled the family's affairs, came forward with a shocking confession. His statement revealed that he had destroyed critical pieces of evidence during Alfredo's trial, including key witness statements that would have convicted him on additional charges. The lawyer had kept his secret hidden for decades, but when confronted, he admitted, "I was paid, not by Alfredo but by others who feared what he knew. They didn't want him to go to prison. They wanted him free." That night, the lawyer's name appeared on the list of the accused, alongside others who had aided in the concealment of Alfredo's crimes. In 2023, after years of public pressure, the Monterrey court system was forced to re-examine the cold case of Jesus Castillo Rangel's murder. Armed with newly discovered evidence, including Beatriz Morales' testimony, the hidden recordings, and the confession of the corrupt lawyer, the case was reopened. The authorities issued arrest warrants for several prominent individuals involved in the decades-long cover-up, including the retired judge who had dismissed the trial so quickly in 1961. But there was one more twist. Alfredo, long dead, was posthumously convicted of crimes that transcended simple murder. He was officially declared responsible for a string of disappearances, the ones that had been covered up, ignored, or simply lost to time. And finally, for the first time in decades, Jesus Castillo Rangel's name was spoken aloud in a court of law, not as a victim, but as a man whose life mattered. The final ruling was symbolic. Justice was no longer about punishing Alfredo. It was about acknowledging the truth, no matter how many years it took to unearth. As the verdict echoed through the chambers, the last piece of the puzzle was revealed. A final, public memorial was established in honor of Jesus, and his family was awarded a posthumous settlement for the pain, the loss, and the decades of silence. Justice, in the end, wasn't about catching Alfredo. It was about reclaiming the lives that had been erased, and about ensuring that history would never forget. Stay tuned for more chilling cases on Cold Case Chronicles, where the truth is always darker than fiction.